Holy cow, we are 10 episodes in to the Mate Doing Men podcast. I tell you, I have learned so much since starting this journey, which, by the way, was an utterly terrifying one to embark upon because, the birth of this idea for this podcast was in September of 2023, and I posted my first episode in February, the middle of February 2024. So I have been burrowing away behind the scenes, trying to understand what my concept is and what questions I'm actually wanting to answer, or at least try to answer. And of course, a big focus of mine is the duality of modern and vintage. And the guests that I've had on so far have taught me so much, but I also feel that the overall consensus at the moment is that the modern world is making us very sad. I mean, I use the word depressed. I don't mean clinical depression, although, there are studies that have indicated, that the modern world has been quite harmful in that way. But when I say depressed, I'm using it as a descriptive term, that we're being made to feel depressed. When I say depressed, I hope people don't think that I mean, or that I'm, doing down clinical depression. I'm very much not. But what I have found from speaking to my guests is that the overall consensus is that, yes, the modern world is making us depressed. And a lot of people have given theories as to why that is, to do with loneliness. That has been a massive theme, and a lack of community, and also the way that convenience is actually taking away so much of what it is to be human rather than providing us with a better quality of life. So there's been a lot of themes that I've come across that just keep cropping up about the modern world and why people decide to live a more simple existence. And another thing that keeps coming up is this idea of kindness, and the fact that the internet isn't usually very kind. It's kind of scary that so many people, especially young people, have an entire world, in the palm of their hand that is inherently very unkind and quite judgmental. So there's a lot of reasons about why the present day, and even looking into the scary notion of the future, is making people feel anxious and depressed and unfulfilled and like they're not achieving everything they should be, and they're not enjoying themselves. So at the moment, I still stand by my theory that the modern world is making us depressed. And what I want to do, and what is a little bit of a shame, is that I haven't yet met anybody that has argued that point. I haven't met anybody that has said, well, no, I think you'll find that you're wrong. Obviously, a lot of my guests they're very grounded, so they're not, living like it's a certain era. They have a very measured approach. So they talk about modern medicine and things like that, and modern mental health care, although that's still got a long way to go, and technology and all of its glory. But they also, they are of the opinion that there's a lot about the modern world that isn't doing us any favors, and that the balance is a little bit skewed. So for episode 10, I just wanted to sit back with you and kind of chew the fat about what we've learnt and what you guys think. And the thing is, you could argue, well, who cares if we find out the modern world's making us depressed? What's that going to achieve? We're in it. We can't time travel, and we can't change what the modern world is. But my argument is, we can, maybe not en masse, but I want these podcasts to be able to empower people to navigate the world that we're in and use history to make sense of ourselves. That's my aim for these podcasts. I don't want them to just be like, oh, well, turns out I was correct. everybody's sad. It's not about that. It's meant to give people a kind of toolkit to, get through this together. And that's the point. We're getting through it together. What I'm mentioning in these episodes might be what you're feeling. You might relate to it in some way, or you might relate to what one of my guests is saying, or you might be somebody that's always had this sense of anemoia and you don't know why, or somebody who really holds on to nostalgia and you're trying to figure out what that means for you and what that means for your future. Or you might be somebody who just really loves antiques, or, somebody who's just never quite fit in. Well, this is the podcast for you. This is the place to be, because like I've said before, I'm interviewing a lot of people who are definitely not on the right side of normal. And it's great. And I love that, because I'm not either. So yeah, I just wanted to add that disclaimer that these podcasts have a purpose. And, they might not reach the millions, but if they reach just one person that needs a little bit of company and a little bit of a safe space, while still addressing issues that are pressing and that they find interesting, that's all I want. I just want to be a little friend coming out of your speakers, that let you know that this world is very, very hard to navigate, and I'm with you. I'm with you on that, and we're going to try and navigate it together. And so what I want to do today is I want to reflect. I want to reflect on everything I've learned, and to do that, I want to take you back to a very important year where the world felt oh so different. And that year is 2019, the pre-pandemic world, our pre-pandemic existence. And I'm not just taking you back to this year because it was right before the pandemic started. I'm taking you back because it was a big year for me. And that's because that is the year that I first went to Japan. Now, I wanted to go to Japan, and I saved up for literally like a year to go on this trip, because I've kind of grown up with Japanese media, and that gave me a huge appreciation for Japanese culture. Probably one of the first things that I came across that I fell in love with were the Studio Ghibli movies. I love the Studio Ghibli movies. They are so magical for me. They're so nostalgic for me. They are my safe haven. I adored them. And a little bit later, I also discovered the Moomins, which was actually based off a book written in the 40s. And I love the Moomins as well. And I enjoyed Pokemon. I enjoyed Sailor Moon. And during school, I would read manga, particularly Fruits Baskets. Like that was my favorite manga ever. And when it got made into a show, I binged it, and when it got made into a show a second time, I binged that as well. I've played a lot of Japanese video games and loved them. Like, it's my favorite genre. My favorite genre of video game is Japanese horror. Like, I love it so much, learning about the folklore and things, and seeing that in a video game. I've just always loved it. So I was a little bit of a nerdy anime kid, really. But I also really enjoyed, similarly in the way that I enjoy vintage, I enjoyed the aesthetic of like an older Japanese life. So I enjoyed what they would wear. I enjoyed their little tea sets. I enjoyed the sliding doors and the bamboo floors, and being surrounded by mountainous beauty all around you. Like I just really fell in love with it. So I knew I wanted to go from day dot. And when I went, I got to experience like both sides of Japan. So I went to Kyoto, and I went into beautiful temples around the suburbs where all the houses are still very traditional. And I went to Akihabara, also known as Electric Town, where it was all about modern tech. And we stayed in Shinjuku as well, which is like, it's the center of Tokyo. So I got to experience both sides of Japan. And I also went to the Studio Ghibli Museum, which is set in the most beautiful little town ever. Like, I loved it. And everywhere you went, there was fields everywhere you looked, and then seconds later you'd be surrounded by skyscrapers. Like, the modern versus traditional duality is huge in Japan. I don't think there's a country anywhere else that encompasses it better than Japan. Like, I'll tell you a story. When we arrived in Kyoto to go and see this temple, I really needed the toilet. And I'd learned a little bit of Japanese for the trip, just so thinking I wouldn't need it, but that was ignorant because I actually did need it, because even in Tokyo, there were a lot of people who weren't English speaking. So I'd learned a little bit of Japanese and I was desperate for the toilet and I could not find a public toilet anywhere. And I was like really starting to panic because we were far away from the temple. And I ended up asking like this guy, I think he was like a traffic warden, and I asked him and he ended up asking a nearby resident who let me into their home and let me use their toilet. Like, if you want to meet the most polite people on the planet, go and meet the Japanese, because they will go out of their way to assist you. They are so they're so obliging. Like, they're just lovely. And this lady let me into her house and let me use her toilet. And in this house, they were of the belief still that you would remove your shoes because outside is unclean and inside is pure. So there's a lot of people in certain parts of Japan that are still living that very traditional lifestyle. And I used, their toilet and I put my shoes back on and then we went to that temple. But you've also got a lot of people in Japan that have kind of abandoned the tradition of, their heritage. I promise there is a point to all of this with regards to my podcast. So the question that's being asked is Japan's culture disappearing? And I've read a lot of articles on this and a lot of studies, and I've been thinking a lot about what my own podcast guests have told me about our own history and our own heritage, not just here in Britain, but wherever you are in the world. All of those little pieces of history, are things like that disappearing? Well, in Japan, they feel that the answer is yes, that with the introduction of technology, the youth are like leaving for bigger cities, and there's a kind of lack of interest or perceived importance of traditions. You know what I mean? There's a lack of practicality in certain Japanese traditions, and so the youth are not really bothered anymore. But Japan has become a huge technological powerhouse. Their technological advances, like, I'm impressed with the Oculus. Japan's like, Oculus, like, whatever. They are so far beyond us. So has it been a positive step that they've kind of lost a bit of culture and heritage because they've progressed forward into building a more modern society? Well, let's answer that question by stepping into the shoes of a normal 20-something in Japan. So the average young person working full-time in Japan spends around 11 hours a day working. And that usually encompasses a 2-hour commute, and that can sometimes be each way. They have a small to non-existent social circle. So that idea of loneliness that has come up a lot in my podcasts, Japanese young people are feeling that heavily. And they tend to live with their parents. They don't enjoy their job. And they're not likely to get a promotion for like another 5 years because the system is seniority based. Sound familiar? So Japan is a lonely city. I mean, for goodness sake, it is the city where one person karaoke blew up. It's the city where you can visit a restaurant and not see a single server or a single other person because they're all in their own individual booths and you get served via a little curtain. Like, I've been to one of those. It's crazy. I mean, for the introvert, or like my partner with somebody with social anxiety, that's probably like a dream come true. But Japan is a very lonely country. And when you finally arrive at your weekend, you spend most of it sleeping, ready for the daily grind on Monday morning. Seriously, does this sound familiar? I mean, there was an artist called Pavel Jaskush. I'm so sorry, I've butchered that. But they did a series of photographs of slumbering salarymen. You must have seen them. If you haven't, go and give them a Google. And it's basically these businessmen in their business suits with their business briefcases and their laptops just sleeping in the street, like sleeping wherever they can sleep because they are so exhausted. I mean, the cool thing about that is that Japan is such a trustworthy nation that they're like, £500 laptop or 500 yen laptop. They're not even worried that it's going to be stolen. But The point is, they are so exhausted that they are sleeping on subways and park benches, or sometimes just on the pavement in the street. And this phenomenon is known as hikikomori, or severe social withdrawal. And it mainly affects those who were born after 1970, i.e. the generation growing up with the home video game system in the era of Japan's arguably highest economic growth. And I think a lot of my listeners are people that also grew up with home video game systems, or at least you saw the birth of them, or you've just literally never known anything else. So, we apparently, according to this Japanese study, we fall into that phenomenon, hikikomori, which is severe social withdrawal. And what it causes is something called modern type depression, where young people tend to feel depressed when they're at work, and at other times, but mainly in their full-time job, they feel very depressed and unfulfilled. And when they're not at work, they enjoy the virtual world of the internet, video games, and pachinko. If you don't know what pachinko is, when you go to Japan, you will see a pachinko station literally on every street corner. It's like the biggest grossing game that the Japanese play. I think it's a gambling game, but I'm not too sure. If it is gambling, I don't think it's much, but I think it is a gambling game. And the questions we need to ask is this modern type depression, is it simply a response to Japan's modernization? And is hikikomori a culture-based syndrome specific to Japan, or actually, is it just a new form of maladjustment for all of us? Because as I keep saying, this is not individual to Japan. Those feelings are not individual to Japan. If they were, they wouldn't keep coming up in these podcasts. And some of my guests have actually said, following the pandemic, we are, as a nation and as a world, going to be hit with a pandemic of psychological problems that the global internet-connected society will have to face. Like, it's coming if it's not already here. But why is the modern world harming our mental health? This concept is so interesting to me because, we've got cars and we've got phones and we've got healthcare and we've got fast food and we've got entertainment. Our modern world, compared to what our ancestors had, we've got it all at our fingertips. If you have the budget, of course. But our world is so colourful and so vast, and you can do so much now. You can experience so much now. Why is our mental health crisis so incredibly bad? And the problem is, in spite of all those amazing things that we have access to, over the last 80 years, mental health issues have steadily increased. And many studies indicate that modernization is generally associated with higher rates of depression. I mean, that's what I'm driving at. But why? Well, some of the reasons is that it can be attributed to the fact that we are overfed, we're living on a very poor diet, and we're living a sedentary lifestyle. A lot of my podcast guests have talked about the loss of the art of doing, and a loss of community. So because everything is so easy now, you don't do much anymore, because what's the point? Because there's usually a faster, more efficient way of getting it done. I liken it to, and I've said this before, putting logs on a fire. Why would you put logs on a fire when you've had the amazing invention of central heating? There's so many ways in which we aren't physically doing stuff anymore. And in some ways that is brilliant, because for people who, maybe have a disability, having life made easier for them and more accessible is incredible. And I would like to get somebody on my show to talk about, what life would have been like for them if we'd have gone a few years back. Because I tell you, I don't think it would have been pretty. And of course, putting rights aside, I'm not ignorant to the fact that as a woman, I probably wouldn't have had a very nice time. And I've said this before with many of my guests, but we still have things too easy, I think. And so we're losing a skill set. We're losing the ability to learn. We're losing our attention span. And the problem is loads of joy can come from doing. You can it's so much fun to do something. Even if it's something like my guest who was a history teacher said that his wife loves making jigsaws. That it's going to be long-winded. You're going to need a lot of patience, but how fun would that be? And how proud would you be after you've done that? And people who like sew their own clothes and things, we don't do stuff like that anymore. And I think these studies are pointing out that that is a big problem. And also the fact that we have sunlight and sleep deprivation, chronic disease, and depression. And now I'm talking about the clinical kind. Because our diet is not great. I mean, I think the first McDonald's was made in the 1950s. So a lot of my content studies the 1940s, and I study a ration diet. I've actually had a go at a ration diet, and I'll tell you, it was tricky. So to compare what we lived on then compared to what we have accessible to us now it's kind of crazy. And I'm not talking about size. I'm not talking about people's sizes. I'm not talking about people's weight. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm just talking about health. I'm just talking about general health, like what is actually in the food that we eat now. And even like in the 40s, it would be quite common to grow your own veg. Now, I do have an allotment and I love it. It gives me so much joy. And I would implore anybody to grow their own veg because one, it saves you money. And two, it's nice to see the fruits of your labour. It just is. So aside from our diet and how much we move, and also our access to sunlight and sleep, which is causing chronic diseases of the physical and mental kind, we're also incredibly competitive. We're constantly seeking perfection. And we're projecting the best sides of our lives through social media, but avoiding real vulnerability. And this is what one of my podcast guests said about connection versus communication. Communication is one thing. We can communicate all the time without any problems, and it's fast and it's instant and whatever. But connection is a different ballgame. And as I said before, not Wi-Fi connection. I'm not talking about Wi-Fi connection. I'm talking about genuine human connection. And that can span in everything. That can span in friendships and dating life. And, even people who work from home, and not having your work colleagues around you anymore. Human connection is dying off. And now it's being replaced with a different kind of connection, a more virtual connection. Like you've got virtual reality. And I interviewed a company behind VR who said that two of their players for this VR game met on VR and then got married. So their argument was a more virtual connection, is just as valid as face-to-face in a coffee shop. And also it does mean that you can sort of hide parts of yourself. You can kind of build a safety bubble around yourself. Like logistically, it's easier just to be able to meet people because it's virtual. And you can also put in less effort to projecting a certain version of yourself when it's not face-to-face. So there's good and bad parts, but I don't think we can deny that meeting people face-to-face doesn't happen as often anymore. And that's why, novelty bars, like I went to Cahoot's bar, they're so popular because nobody was on their phone either. I was on my bloody phone because I had to do content for them, typical. But nobody else was on their phone. Everybody was having genuine connections and it was really wicked to see. And so no wonder they get booked out like literally all the time because that is rare nowadays. And the thing is, maybe our grandparents were less burdened by disappointment because they weren't socialized to expect as much. And you get that thing, don't you, with parents and grandparents where they're like, oh, you don't know you're born and things. And I believe it when my mum says, we had it rough. I believe that my mum and my aunties, my uncles and my grandparents did have it rough. But my mum will also say that when she was growing up, there just wasn't as much expected of her. And even things like going to university, it wasn't like an expected thing. And so there was less disappointment because they just weren't expected to achieve as much as maybe generations after them are expected to do. And that is definitely not helped by social media where it's in your face every single day what you could have been versus what you are. And the way that we measure success has become very skewed. And I think people's idea of success these days lacks a lot of substance. So yeah, to sum up, we are living in a socially isolated environment, and no better is that encapsulated than in Japan. I mean, when we went there, we visited, I think it's called Kawaguchiko, which is the town surrounding Mount Fuji. And little did we know that the Aokigahara forest, I'll let you Google that yourself, Aokigahara forest is in that same area. We did not go in, but we did see it. We sort of saw the opening of it. And that, of course, is a huge symbol for the mental health crisis that Japan is suffering from to this day. And I'm sure the COVID pandemic did not help with that at all. And one of the studies I read kind of concluded in a very interesting way. And it said that, to put it another way, the modern man would likely be much more resilient to the toils of living if he were physically fit, well rested, free of chronic disease and financial stress, surrounded by close family and friends, and felt pride in meaningful work. And this study basically alluded to the fact that we do not, as a modern society, possess those things most of the time. And I want someone to come and argue against me. I want someone to say, no, every facet of living in the modern world and all of the technological advances are great. You're just not handling it right. But I am yet to find such a guest. So what I'm left with is a lot of lonely and lost people who are looking to the past to anchor themselves in the present and stay steadfast for what is to come. Oh, and if you're wondering what Bonenkai means, which is the name of this episode, it literally translates to forget the year gathering. And basically, this is a Japanese drinking party that takes place at the end of the year, and its aim is to forget the woes and troubles of the past year. But maybe in forgetting the past, we're actually forging a very difficult and unnatural future.